Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on the Royal Commission recommendations. We'll just give everybody a couple more minutes to get online. There's a few people still coming online, so I'll be back online in about 2 minutes. Thanks. Okay, I think that should be enough time to get us started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Fahim Khondaker. I'm a partner here at BDO in the Data Analytics and Insights team. I've been, for those of you who are coming back for I think this is webinar number 4. So for those of you who are coming back for this webinar series, welcome back. And those of you who are first time joining us, welcome as well. Before I start, can I just kick off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we've all gathered today. There are many people from across the country today, so I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging across all of those communities. In terms of today, you'll see me, apologies, you'll see me looking up at a couple of screens because I've got a few things on that I have to navigate through to show you today. So if I'm not paying direct attention to the camera, that's why. We're trying to break up today into 2 or 3 parts. Firstly, those of you who, as I said, this is probably webinar number 4. So I'm going to do a quick 5-minute overview just to catch you up so that you get the most value out of this webinar today in terms of what's been since we started this project and working with the Royal Commission. And then we'll just dive straight into a bit of an overview of the government response, and then we'll go right down to the detail. So if you do not want to see the detail, if you're not too interested in too much of the detail, please feel free to leave at the half-an-hour mark. I think that'll be perfectly okay. I will try set out what's coming from a details perspective, so you know whether to stay on or not. The other thing to note as well is there's a questions box on the right-hand panel. I'll monitor that every 5 or 10 minutes or so, so please feel free to jump in and put in any questions that you may have. I will warn you that this whole thing with the Royal Commission is obviously a big work in progress for everybody, and we're all trying to get our heads around it, including the whole industry. So there may be some questions I'll have to take on notice and come back to you where possible. So with that, let's get started. If it'll work. There we go. Okay, so those of you who are joining us for the first time, just for your benefit, we were engaged by the Royal Commission to assess the profitability and viability of the sector. And in September 2020, we actually presented our report, which is on the Royal Commission's website. And we were also asked to present at the Royal Commission hearing as an expert witness. Off the back of that, we organised a roundtable with aged care providers, mostly in Brisbane, to get some thoughts on what would be useful in terms of how to analyse the Royal Commission recommendations. So a lot of what you'll see today will be feedback that we've had co-designed with aged care providers. We've also had tons of meetings with peak bodies and other stakeholders in the sector as well. We then had our first webinar where we presented basically a summary version of our work with the Royal Commission, And also at that stage, I think the draft recommendations were out in December. And then in March, the final recommendations came out. So we had a series of events for that as well. And we basically did our analysis of those recommendations. And where we are today is basically the government's response. We did do a little bit of a response analysis in the federal budget analysis that BDO does nationally. So on our website, you can find some of that analysis as well. And we did present a little bit of the preliminary analysis of what's in the budget for aged care. Today is building on from that to a little bit more of a deeper dive into what's in and what's out. So we'll go from there. Those of you who have read the Royal Commission recommendations, there's 148 of them. I think the recommendations booklet is about 100 pages. The Royal Commission report's about 3,000 pages. The Royal Commission came up with about 26 categories to split them into. And then on the right-hand side of my screen here, there's a 100-page document from the federal government talking about their response to the recommendations. And what they've done is they've gone through each recommendation and categorized whether they agree with it in principle or reject it. So we will go through some of that today, hopefully at a high enough level that if you are an executive or a board member or even an employee, it gives you a bit of an overview today. We've only got about 45 minutes or so. So you'll just get a bit of an overview, and hopefully it'll point you to exactly where to dive deep into your relevant areas. We have also taken out some specific items that we want to discuss and give our opinion or our views based on what we've heard from talking to people in the sector, and hopefully some pointers on what will help and won't going forward. We'll wrap up with a bit of a where to next if you're an aged care provider, and we've now been talking to, I don't know, 15 plus providers, and they've all we've kind of taken that advice from each of them and come up with a bit of an action plan of what you can do next to take advantage of the disruption that's in the market. It is the largest disruption to the aged care industry in 25 years or so. So there's a huge opportunity to make positive change. And there's also a huge opportunity for organizations to thrive in the new era. There's also greater awareness for aged care from a policy perspective and political perspective as well. So obviously that gives that attention brings with it an opportunity to do things differently. Our view probably is that organizations that are better prepared now will probably thrive over the next 12 to 18 months. I did note in the list of registrants, there's a lot of CFOs and financial analysts on the call today or on the webinar today. I, as an accountant myself, I would think there's no better time than now to be a CFO or in the finance team of an aged care industry. Because what will happen over the next 6 to 12 months is analysis of commercial drivers of an organization, or understanding what makes an organization sustainable financially while delivering quality care in a cost-effective manner. Getting that balance right, it'll be a really great opportunity for CFOs and financial advisors to show off their skills and basically take a more important leading role in their organizations. So hopefully that'll be really good for the sector. We are working with the likes of CPA Australia and the Chartered Accountants Institutes as well to get that message across as well, and provide whatever support we can to those teams. As some of you will know, what we did at BDO is we came up with a bit more of a practical way to view the recommendations rather than the 26 categories that the Royal Commission released. And we ended up with 5 or 6 categories, and then we mapped every recommendation to those categories. So as an overview, for example, we know that there were 33 recommendations that we think relate to workforce issues. And then on the flip side, there's 56 that relate to governance matters. So I'll jump into some of that analysis to set the scene today. and then we'll go down to the government's response on a category by category basis, and just to let you know what you need to be aware of going forward. So let's just jump straight in. So hopefully you can still see my screen. It's probably no way for me to know that, but I'm hoping that's all fine. So as you can see over the top, we've got the bar charts just showing the categories of the recommendations. And in the ones below, we've kind of categorized the government's response to them. So the darker colors are the government's acceptance of those recommendations. And as we go right lower down, they've got some that they do not accept, some they believe requires further consultations, and some they have notes or additional advice on. So I'll just start with the ones that people are most interested in terms of what hasn't been accepted. There were about 7 recommendations from memory, 1, 2, 3, 6, sorry. No, 7. That the government did not accept. And so they're mostly related to how the fees would work, and also the means testing, linking to the Productivity Commission report earlier. And then the big one was the funding for the new tax, essentially, to fund this. So that'll be an interesting development going forward in terms of keeping an eye on that one. Then the other one worth noting as well is there was a recommendation about award wages to go up. The government's just noted that the Fair Work Commission's looking at that. So again, another one to keep an eye on. And then from a supports instead perspective, I'm just going to do one thing there. There was 4 recommendations where the government basically didn't reject what was recommended, but they provided an alternative essentially. And we'll talk to some of those in a few minutes as well. The Australian Aged Care Commission was an interesting one. So basically, many of you will be across that the 2 commissioners disagreed on how the sector and the industry should be governed. And Commissioner Pagone went down the line of a series of independent organisations being set up to monitor, whereas Commissioner Briggs recommended that either the existing organisations get revamped with additional powers, or basically a minister remains responsible for it. The government has gone down Commissioner Briggs's response of not setting up a whole bunch of independent entities. So a great example is the Australian Aged Care Pricing Authority, which is proposed to be an independent organisation, a brand new one for aged care by Commissioner Pagone. Commissioner Briggs suggested that we change the current hospital pricing authorities position, terms of reference, and use that same so there's still independence, but the accountabilities to a minister stay, and the government has chosen the Commissioner Briggs approach essentially. So we'll go into some of those in a bit of detail just soon. The other thing I'll just note as well is this is very high level, obviously. So what we did do as BDO is, and I'll just minimize that. Bear with me for 2 seconds. Is we then took it one level lower. So for example, workforce, if I click on the workforce recommendations, we can see that the next layer down of detail of how those workforce recommendations are broken down included things about additional specialist staff, education and training, employer remuneration, roles and responsibilities, and workforce planning. What I'll do is I'll talk to those in the context of government response again. And just before I do, the other thing I want to show you is the final thing we did as BDO is we looked at the timeline in which some of these recommendations will come into effect. And you can see that they've gone for end of financial years, so July 22, July 21, July 23, and they've gone for end of calendar years, where at the end of December, there's a bit of a spike, and 24 of them didn't have a timeline attached to them in the recommendations. But what I do want to do is I just want to look at that at the response level. So again, if I expand what's been responded. You can see some of the red is essentially does not accept. Majority of the recommendations that are responded and accepted essentially do come into effect in the same sort of time period. So there's no disproportionate situation where all the ones that are immediate have been rejected and all the ones in the future have been accepted or anything like that. So that's just a small observation. The one that I do want to talk a little bit about today probably is, let's look at the governance ones. So in terms of governance, there were, I think we came up with 5 subcategories where we classified each of the recommendations. So entry requirements, minimum standards, some penalties, reporting requirements, and responsibilities and accountability. And you can see the government's response to each of those categories. So penalties, for example, there were 2 that they classified as requiring further consideration, and they've accepted 5 of them. The issue is going to be in the areas of how is that all going to get funded. So if I look at the ones that they consider to be requiring further consultation, recommendations around mandatory minimum qualifications, employment status, civil penalty recommendation, and also compensation for the breach of those civil provisions as well. So the government hasn't accepted or rejected, they've just said that we need further conversations on some of those. The one that a lot of people are interested in obviously is in the financial side of things. As I showed you earlier, a lot of the funding ones were not accepted. I'll just open up the subcategories of what was covered in the financial recommendations. So there were 13 recommendations around funding for additional services. There were 4 recommendations around specific segments of the community, 27 in relation to setting up new entities or regulations, which will then have flow-on impacts for providers in terms of funding and financial capability, financial implications. So just going through each of those categories, we've got the capability to then essentially analyze those recommendations from a from a detail perspective. And we've done all of this in previous webinars, so I won't cover it in detail again. We are working on making some of this available on our website as well, so you can interact through it yourself. The intent of it wasn't to replace the Royal Commission recommendations in any way, shape or form. It is just to show how it's broken up so that you can see from an operational and strategic perspective as your organization what you need to watch out for and make some informed decisions as well. So I'll leave that there from a recommendations perspective, and I'll just go back to my slides. We'll come back to this one as well. Let's then just dive straight into the detail of what's in the budget, as well as the detailed response. I've got a bit of a category list on the left here. What I thought we'd do is we'd probably just do a quick 5-minute on what's in the budget. We've then done a bit of a media scan of what other organisations have said about the government response to date, and that's always interesting to note and just have a look at. And then we've got various components of the responses that we've done a bit of a summary and categorization of and a bit of a discussion on. So we'll do that. I'll keep monitoring any questions as they come through. Please feel free to put through questions as you see fit. So let's start with the budget. As you know, there's about 17.7 billion committed over a 5-year period. That's the problem with calling it 17.7 billion is it doesn't kind of stipulate how big an investment that is in the context of the industry. So the industry is approximately 30 billion revenue. So over 5 years, we're talking about a 10% sort of increase. So that's probably the way, firstly, to have a consideration. Secondly, of that 17.7 billion, I think about 4 or 5 items make up 85% of it. The government has come up with 5 what they're calling pillars of the funding. So just if you're not familiar with it already, here's the high-level highlights. So home care is a pillar in itself. So there's a big discussion around home care packages being cleared, the waitlist being cleared, $6.5 billion there. There's also $800 million worth of funding for informal carers as well. We'll probably go into a bit more detail a bit later, but the home care packages, clearing will be one thing, but it'll also be a case of the logistics of the workforce required to service that will be an issue to discuss, as well as those packages come into effect in that clearance, the target is 2 years' time. We're not sure whether the government has commented on any increases to that wait list by the time it comes into effect and what that looks like. So that'll be one to keep an eye on. From a residential aged care services and sustainability perspective, there was basically the government mandated staffing ratios, so 200 minutes per day, and 40 of that has to be done by a registered nurse. I did note somewhere one of the groups analysing that did notice that there was basically no explicit requirement for those registered nurses to be on site. There may be an implicit one, but again, just to keep an eye on. And then there's an increase of a $10 per bed day sort of funding as well for aged care providers in the residential aged care area. And the government does go into detail of what that's supposed to, which recommendations that relates to. So that adds up to about $3 billion. The quality and care and safety side gets about $1 billion as well. Big thing around medication management, the care, the healthcare transitions and primary care as well. The one that I just wanted to note was probably the last one there. There's a new star rating system that'll have significant market implications for providers because it'll now be public providers. It's envisaged that it'll be easy to rate a provider with a star rating, just kind of like Google reviews, or for those of you who remember probably almost a decade ago now, TripAdvisor. And that had implications for providers on the TripAdvisor story, for example. Hotels was quite significantly impacted by the types of ratings they were receiving on TripAdvisor. So it's one to keep an eye on in terms of coming up with a strategy and a response of how your organization is going to respond to that. So that's important. From a workforce perspective, a single assessment workforce, 228 million, and financial support for registered nurses, about 136 million was noted. As I noted earlier, there are a couple of matters relating to wages that the government has either noted is currently being covered by the Fair Work Commission, and also there were a couple that they've rejected at this stage as well. So that one will be one to keep an eye on as well. The pricing authority will be an important entity in enforcing some of those funding things, and we'll go into that in a bit of detail soon. And then from a governance perspective, worth noting the 630 million for regional, rural and remote areas. That's going to be a good investment in the context of focus. The question's always going to be on all of this is whether that sufficient amount is going to be important to keep an eye on, and how the government responds over the coming months as we lead up to an election. That'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on as well. There are new governance structures being recommended. I do want to note this particular one being the Council of Elders, or the National Aged Care Advisory Council as well. So that's quite a prominent, strategically significance-wise, that's quite a big thing. Just worth noting. How it's implemented and executed and how effective it is will obviously come down to the execution. However, that's worth just noting from the outset. The media responses across organizations. So we've gone through a whole group of organizations that we thought were relevant to just look up what they had to say. It's not too, there's some common themes around being a good start, the numbers being monitored, whether that's sufficient. So it'll be interesting to see how flexible this funding is, and how much it responds to how the market then responds as well. So obviously there's going to be funding released into the sector on various initiatives over the next 5 years. But how quickly does the government then take feedback from that sector back up? And obviously the pricing authorities' recommendations as well will make a big difference. The Australian Medical Association have made some comments. I think the nursing and midwifery one is probably the most direct. So they obviously talked about staffing as a big one, and they did have the statement about saying that it's nowhere near enough. And they were the ones, as I mentioned earlier, saying that there was no explicit requirement to be on site, which is going to be interesting to see how it'll continue going. A lot of people have said that whether it's sufficient money or insufficient money, we do need to start talking about how it's going to be managed and how we're going to analyze its implications and its impact so that we can optimize and refine how we channel the funding in future, or any future funding if there's any as well. So what we don't want is a situation where any of this money is wasted in poor implementation in any way, shape or form. So I think the industry as a whole will have to work together on that, and continuous collaboration between regulators, between providers, between peak bodies and consumers as well is going to be really, really important. As I said, common theme seems to be this is a good start, essentially, and it's been welcomed from a attention perspective as well, which is great. I'm just trying to see if there's anyone else that's worth mentioning. The dementia one was really noteworthy as well. There's a lot of attention paid to dementia in the budget as well, and there's a lot of detail about the quality requirements on the dementia side of things as well. That does get us to about the halfway mark. And the reason I want to mark that is we will probably go into a bit of detail in some of those categories now. So if it may not be of interest to a lot of people as well, given it may not affect your day-to-day job. What we've essentially done is we've summarized a 103-page document into about 15 pages. So it's still a lot. 15 pages is still a lot. So please feel free, if you want half an hour back in your day and you don't want to listen to the detail, please feel free to go take that up, and you can come back to the recordings if you want. In terms of the categories we're going to cover, I've kind of put them up in a bit of an order. So setup is setting up of new agencies. It's on the left here. We'll talk about quality. I'll start with governance because there's quite a lot of requirements around governance, around financial reporting and things like that are worth noting. The funding model is worth looking at as well. And then industry workforce and training workforce is obviously a very key issue across the sector. Then there's probably just as, not lesser important, but from a priority perspective, we've covered all of those as well. But I think a lot of the discussion will sit around the governance areas because that's what will impact you almost immediately. So with that, jumping in. So the new Act, can I just say personally, I think it's really, really great that a new Act which talks about enshrining into law the right to aged care. So in Australia, I'm a migrant myself, and coming into Australia, it was very noticeable that you're entitled to healthcare, you're entitled to education at the school level for free, and now you're entitled to aged care as well, which is really great, like from a human rights perspective, from an from the rights of the elderly perspective. The drafting will start almost immediately. In fact, the bill was introduced to Parliament on the 27th of May, so just last week. The idea is to have this law come into effect on 1 July 2023. There'll be a lot of consultation going on, so please get yourself involved if you're passionate about that into those consultation channels. What I'll note about what was introduced in Parliament last week, there's a huge focus in terms of priority on restrictive practices, so restraints on and how that's monitored. In fact, I think there's an individual role being created to monitor that specifically. The home care assurance reviews are a big focus in the Act and almost immediately flagged by the Minister. And then repealing the aged care financing authority in its current form as well has been flagged in the introduction of the bill. So bills in Parliament will go through a process. There'll be first and second readings and debate and lots of things, obviously. And then there'll be lots of consultation through that process as well. And it wouldn't surprise me if committees and things like that are set up as well in Parliament as well. So that's worth noting. The Australian Aged Care Commission, I guess basically there won't be one. There won't be an Australian Aged Care Commission as recommended by Commissioner Pagone. Instead, they're going to go with what Commissioner Briggs suggested, which will be across multiple areas. So there'll be a cabinet minister responsible for it. There'll be the Council of Elders, and then there'll be this Aged Care Safety and Quality Authority that will be essentially empowered to do some of those roles that was envisaged by Commissioner Pagone. And that is a philosophical shift, as I mentioned earlier. One was truly independent oversight, has no accountability to a government minister. And Commissioner Briggs went, well, you can be independent, but you still need to be accountable to the Australian public. And the easiest way to be accountable to the Australian public is to be accountable to a politician or a minister, essentially. The Aged Care Pricing Authority, again, really important. Again, there won't be a new Australian pricing authority. However, the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority will be expanded to include the Aged Care Pricing Authority. Some changes will come into effect as early as next month, so that'll be interesting to see how you go. And there will actually be a legislation or a requirement of providers to participate with the pricing authority. So that'll be one to keep an eye on very closely. It will impact you, and to be honest, it's one you want to be involved in because they're the ones who are going to decide what is the appropriate levels of funding for the services you offer, including your admin and governance services as well. So that's a big one to keep in mind. Anything else worth noting here? The Aged Care Advisory Council will go ahead. There will be one. And then there will be an Inspector General of Aged Care as well. Worth noting, again, it's more about just as a provider, you probably need to be across who are the key regulators and regulatory stakeholders that you as a provider are accountable to, and just being across that is really, really important. Anything else worth noting here? Probably not too much, other than there was a really big push for research. I think there was a stipulated amount that the Royal Commission suggested that needs to be funding research into this area for innovation into aged care and the quality of care. The government basically said, yep, we agree in principle. However, we're not going to create a new research channel. We're just going to go through whatever existing research channels we have and provide some funding. And there's the number, so 1.8%. So the government basically said that that's not sustainable. So they will not be funding 1.8% of total expenditure that they spend in aged care on research. So take off that what you will, but they did accept it in principle. Data governance is quite a big one. Data, even from a practical perspective, data is going to be really, really important to make informed decisions as a provider. So, so just worth noting that data gets mentioned a few times across the recommendations, and the government has accepted some of those things in principle or accepted them outright. It's just a matter of where they think it'll get addressed. Similarly with IT architecture and investment in technology, again, interoperability through the My Health record with aged care is something that they're looking at essentially to improve. From a funding perspective, as I mentioned, there's a $10 per day extra per person basic daily fee that'll continue, and there's a continuation of the 30% increase to the viability of the supplements of the viability and homeless supplements. The pricing will be pushed out, so this will be interesting because the Independent Pricing Authority effectively will advise on the new pricing from 1 July 2023. The problem is a lot of the obligations will come into effect before then, so funding those obligations will be important. And when I say obligations, it's both operationally in terms of the service levels, as well as from a governance and reporting perspective. So it'll be one to just keep a really close eye on and influence if you have any power to do so. What else have we got here? Subject to, there's nothing, I will leave all of those ones out. We'll move to the next category about quality. I won't go into too much detail other than saying that there's a lot of details on what the government specifically wants on dementia and analysis of dementia and reporting on quality on dementia treatment or care. All the other ones that basically identified which organizations will be responsible to come up with the quality indicators, which is probably not a bad thing. Like, it's good that the government hasn't jumped straight to a conclusion. They've kind of basically said, we accept it, we require it, but we do acknowledge that entities have been set up to manage those quality indicators, so we'll be passing that responsibility to those entities or re-emphasizing those entities. There's a bit of discussion around, there's actually a lot of discussion around collaboration with state and territory governments. I think that almost without doubt is off the back of COVID and off the back of more recently the vaccination rollout, I imagine, about roles and responsibilities between different levels of government. So there's a lot of mention of that as well. So worth noting, there will be a quality standards review that basically has kicked off already and has to be done by the end of next year. So just worth noting that as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail on some of these unless someone actually asks me the question, and I haven't seen any questions, so I'll come back to these. Our plan is to probably put all of this into a bit of a report, but I'm also mindful that there's a million reports out there on this stuff as well. So personally, my preference would be to move to what are the practical things we need to do now, which will then incorporate, once we know the practical things, we need to incorporate some of these analysis to make sure that whatever we're proposing practically is informed by what is required and our understanding of where the opportunities may be as well. The governance one is probably the most noteworthy, and I think we will spend a little bit of time on this one if we can, like maybe 5 minutes. So essentially, the couples that I want to note is there'll be new approval requirements for all aged care providers to basically for new ones coming in. I don't know whether that'll then apply retrospectively to existing providers, but that's worth noting. This one I was talking to earlier about the rating system and talking to you about how that may impact reputation, and reputation is going to be quite important going forward. And so essentially the way they're talking about consumer experience reporting is initially with a sample of 10% of your providers, care recipients, and then going forward by the end of 2022, there'll be an online star rating system where pretty much everyone will be allowed to rate. So it'll be interesting, it'll be important to get the communication right with not only your care recipients, but their families as well, obviously. There'll be, so coroner's additional reporting requirements according to the new Aged Care Act, but again, there'll be lots of consultation before those things get sorted out. The ones that really jumped out essentially was there were some quarterly reporting requirements and things like that. So I'll jump into those in a sec. I will note the whistleblower policy. Obviously, when you have a royal commission in a particular sector, the potential for whistleblowers and making sure whistleblowers have an opportunity to exercise their right and receive the appropriate protections is really important. So the government noted that that protection that the recommendation Royal Commission recommended already exists. So that's not an issue. This was the other one as well, the civil penalties, and I know a lot of the peak bodies actually advocated quite strongly on this matter for the sector. So the government has basically pushed that into those consultation phase so that it gets considered as part of the new act. So it hasn't ruled it out. It's just saying that additional consultations are effectively required. Here you go, some more governance requirements. So from 1 July next year, 2022, you'll have to start reporting on how many minutes people were served by various types of employees. And then that'll inform the star rating as well. So that'll be interesting to see how that interfaces. Here's probably the ones that'll impact, I imagine, private providers, and not just private providers, anyone operating in a group of entities rather than just a single entity as a provider. And when I say group of entities, I'm not referring to multiple providers, I'm talking about other activities. So basically a conglomerate of services. So in the not-for-profit sector, the faith-based providers often have a group of entities, and HK becomes one entity in there. And then obviously in the private sector, these groups are used quite often. The government is going to require in the Act that there will be minimum requirements for liquidity and capital adequacy within 2 years from now, and 3 years for capital adequacy. The government did say they are going to consult the sector. We think the way it's currently structured in terms of the finances of providers, how this particular recommendation is acted upon will have significant implications for everyone. Here's one that a lot of people probably won't like in terms of burden, admin burden. So quarterly reports will have to be required from July next year, July 2022. And if you can just imagine the implication of that being, look at board timing, executive timing, and things like that internally to get your internal approvals to then submit that has significant admin overhead associated with something like that. So you've basically got about 12 months to try streamline that process so that you can report quarterly in as much detail as required. I think I spoke to a couple of the providers, and they were saying that the requirement now is to report on the group of entities and not just your HK approved provider. So if you're now having to report on groups quarterly, group entities quarterly, that could pile up quite quickly in terms of effort. So understanding that process really well of how you currently report and looking for those efficiencies and finding out how you can streamline that to the best of your capability, that will be really, really important, especially if there are manual processes on parts of it. So if there are Excel files involved where data is gathered from various systems, that probably needs a looking at because it'll just exponentially increase that effort. And then there'll be significant monitoring of those requirements as well. So in terms of liquidity and capital adequacy. The funding model area, the big thing is for home care providers being paid in arrears for actual services is really important to note, and also any unspent funds will be retained by the government essentially. So that'll be, so you won't have cash flow if you're receiving that at the moment. So worth noting how that works. and how the working capital needs will be met and things like that will be one to keep a really close eye on, and also the implications for your organizations. And this is where I think the CFOs and the finance people in the room today probably need to just do some forward planning and scenario planning to understand the implications of delays in receiving funding and things like that on your organization from a sustainability perspective. And then if you couple that with the liquidity ratios, which I suppose liquidity ratios will most likely apply to residential aged care providers only. But again, there's some implications on liquidity and solvency as well. In terms of anything else that's worth noting, there was a bit of a reconciliation between home care and aged care in terms of what funding can be available, and there's basically now an upper limit on the home care funding to basically say that you can't get more than what you get for similar funding for aged care, residential aged care. There'll be a new case mix classification system, which will be important to keep an eye on and how that'll work. And a reassessment approach is also kind of being considered as part of this. So again, huge implications. These just look like one or two sentences, but they'll have huge potential implications. So staying ahead of it, thinking through as an executive team or as a board what those implications may be, and being prepared for those implications depending on whichever scenario is really, really important. Making sure your voice is represented in some way, shape or form, whether directly or through peak bodies or through other channels, is probably important as well. There's only about 900 residential or approved providers, 900 providers or so. So it's worth having a bit of a, like, every voice will make a difference. So it's worth noting that and making sure that you do have your voice heard as well, to ensure that you get the quality of uplift and also the balance between admin requirements, administration requirements, the funding and the quality, those three sectors, those three components working well together. Anything else worth noting there? Not really. We'll just jump to the next one, which is the workforce area, and everybody knows there's a lot of talk about workforce. So a couple of things in there is that there's going to be integrated workforce elements at the touch points of GPs and primary care and things like that. Greater integration has been recommended. Also, basically, other organisations now have some responsibilities to implement that. So the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners will have a say. There'll be others as well. So as an industry, just be prepared for others to have more of a say and be loud about your sector. So just make sure that you are prepared to consume that information in the right way so that you understand the implications and you remain one step ahead where possible. I really liked this one, and I think I was alluding to it earlier, which was about the feds working with the state and territory governments much more closely to work out roles and responsibilities and the clarity of those roles and responsibilities. It's probably more a communications exercise than it is an actual delineation of roles and responsibilities, but again, it's going to be really important to understand and ensure that. The Aged Care Workforce Industry Council, the Royal Commission made lots of recommendations about essentially increasing the influence of that council. The government's basically accepted the recommendation. However, they've noted that they themselves have set up the Human Services Skills Organisation as well recently. So the two bodies are expected to collaborate together in relation to qualifications and things like that. A national registration scheme has been accepted in principle, but they haven't worked out how they're going to execute that. Again, from a workforce perspective, there's two benefits of registration that come to mind. There are lots of benefits, but the two, one is a sense of belonging to the sector and a sense of professionalism to the sector, to the profession. And the second is the workforce data that it gives you. So it gives you visibility on where people are and things like that. So in an aggregated manner, that's really, really useful. We've done a fair bit of work in various other sectors around workforce. So education, for example, with teaching staff, school teaching staff. And again, we found that registration early gives you that view of pipeline. So you can start planning out your workforce 3-4 years out, looking at the graduation pools and things like that as well. And potentially, hopefully that might help with informing the sector around workforce challenges, but a lot of them are quite well known as well. So we probably need some strategies to execute on those challenges as well. Anything else worth noting here? Not overly. So the Certificate 3 in individual support is currently being reviewed. So there'll be probably within the next few months, you'll probably hear a bit more around that, which may have, again, immediate implications on the ground. So that's worth noting. Dementia will have a big focus, and palliative care will have a big focus in that from a workforce perspective. So training and collaboration between providers and ITOs will be quite important on this one as well. I'm probably not going to go into too much more detail on these ones. I'm probably going to run out of time very soon. Worth noting from an interface with the public perspective, the government has basically said that there needs to be a data strategy created to help with all aspects. Which is really important because the government's basically saying we need more information to get this right. That was one that kind of came out quite quickly. The increasing of public awareness is quite a big one as well. It'll be interesting how well the digital platforms work, because government historically has had digital platforms. So if you think schooling, my school, the MyGov on a personal basis, the MyGov website and things like that. Those are pretty large, significant projects that take quite a while to firstly implement and then secondly refine and get right to work. So given some of this interface with the public with additional funding required to provide more information to people, how the government facilitates sharing of that will be really important, and that again will have implications for providers, because it's really hard to get information for relatives, essentially, at the moment, is the general consensus. So in the short term, there may be opportunities for providers to do it themselves, but in the long run, the government is sort of taken on the responsibility to make some sort of framework to make that available. So that's really worth noting. There was a whole paper on culture and particularly relating to First Nations people and pathways for them to get access and better access. There's probably an element as well to add to that about diverse communities, given how diverse the workforce is in this sector. So just working through that, there'll be a lot of focus on that, and cultural awareness training, for example, is going to be mandatory as well. The government has noted that their own employees will get cultural safety training. They haven't said whether they'll provide that for providers, but I think one of the recommendations was that it becomes mandatory for providers to provide cultural awareness training as well. So there's a fair bit there, as you can see, and it'll be depending on which areas you are involved in your organization that you should do the deep dive in. What we will do is we'll put this into a report format, this document that you're looking at today, and we'll circulate that to the attendees today as well, so you'll have it as a reference document. And what I'll spend the last 5 minutes doing, though, is just talking about what you can do practically. So what we've done is I've draw your attention to the right here first. We think if you take a step back and a very bird's eye view on how to approach what to do as an organization, if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, hopefully this will help a little bit. We think there are three very broad focus areas that are worth noting. So your financial sustainability and being able to survive as an organization, and then maybe even going on to growth, keeping that in mind. Your workforce and how you operate, your right capability, making sure you have the right technology to deliver those services and things like that, and the right people. And then your branding, marketing, and your consumer experience, so how you actually care and the experience that people have interacting with you. You probably have to work on all three of those areas to various degrees in the context of the recommendations and the funding that's available. Now that can get really overwhelming, so we've come up with a bit of a framework to suggest to help. If you start at the bottom, get your strategic priorities right. So these three things, if there's others that are important to you, get those in there and get them well documented, well understood by everyone. Then probably the hardest bit is to get the data that you need to give you a bit of a baseline of how you're currently performing against each of those areas. And then working with a couple of providers, we've come up with, there's about 8 areas of focus for them at least. So asset management, compliance, finance, risk and governance, digital, operating model, workforce, and branding and communications. I'll note in yellow that quality and consumer experience kind of goes across a few things. Digital includes new technology as well that you may require, or improving what you currently have, or automating where possible. If you go through each of those areas, they themselves will come up with initiatives that you can come up with to improve. You probably need a bit of a framework to then go, okay, how am I going to work out which one's more important? So that needs to be established. And then you need to then go, okay, once we've got a prioritized list of what needs to be done, can we implement those? And then there'll be a process to do that as well. You'll need to come up with a business case, work out how much you're going to fund for it, get the plan developed, and then execute that. And then you just keep repeating that cycle. What we're hoping is that this becomes what everybody does. It sounds overly simplistic, obviously, because that's it's an overview initially. But if this can be the anchor point that everyone comes back to and goes, okay, this is what we're trying to achieve, or something of this nature, then suddenly when you're listening to new updates from the government about funding, about requirements and things like that, you've got a frame of reference to go, okay, that impacts this area or that impacts that area, and therefore a particular project should either get reprioritized or taken off or things like that. So just one way to practically think through how you could tackle these challenges. From what we've seen with the providers that we've spoken to, almost all of them have some form of attention to this now. Some larger ones have big project teams set up to tackle this. The smaller providers have at least 1 or 2 people tackling this as well, or at least paying attention to this. So it's really, really important that I think you get this something in train a bit, and get it onto your agendas for various meetings and things like that, particularly at the board level. I think your board will be really, really interested in that to see how that goes. And the next 2 years, it's one thing to monitor the policy and funding and all of those announcements that are going to come, but you probably have a little bit of time that's really important to get yourself prepared for no matter what comes. So imagine scenarios of what may come and plan for that, essentially. From our perspective, the next steps, we'll continue doing quarterly discussions around Royal Commission for the next 12 to 18 months at least. So please feel free to join them. There'll be various forums we'll be speaking through. We're partnering with a lot of organizations as well, like CEDA, for example, and other providers or intermediaries and peak bodies and things like that as well, to get as much of this message out as possible. I think we all have to work together. There's an avalanche of information. So we as BDO would obviously love to be involved in that with you. So please feel free to come along to our quarterly events and invite others. We'll make that interactive dashboard available on our website very soon. and then we'll make some of the presentation today available to you as well. Can I just finally just thank my colleague Alex Taylor, who helped put all of this together for me as well. With me, we've been working quite hard since July 2020 on the Royal Commission, and there's a broader team as well. So I get to do the fun presentation, but Alex is also quite involved heavily behind the scenes as well. Please feel free to reach out if you have any queries or would like a one-on-one conversation as well. Very happy to do that. So with that, bang on 11 o'clock, I wish you all a very happy day and good luck for the rest of the day. And we'll see you at our next event. Take care.